speaker of the hour is Brother Randy Watson. And Randy is a native of Independence, Missouri, and has labored in the area in both secular work and evangelistic endeavors for several years. He grew up attending here at 39th Street Church of Christ, and was a member for most of the years of his life. He has preached in Kansas, Missouri, and California. He was involved with the work in Riga Central Church of Christ for 18 years, with nearly 7 years of full-time labor with that congregation. He has also done work in India and in the Philippines. And he and his wife Beth have a strong desire to be more involved with foreign evangelism in the future. They are working towards that goal and will be laboring under the oversight of the eldership here at 39th Street. They plan to move to this area in the near future. Brother Randy's topic is If We Warn Them About False Teachers in Sheep's Clothing.
Well, we did already move here in the near future a couple of years ago, so the updated one didn't get printed out, I guess. But we still do desire to do more mission work and involved with that. But we're doing labors right now with the church in Eudora, Kansas. We're very thankful for that opportunity. Good brethren there who are very supportive of sound teaching and evangelism, and so we're thankful for that. You know, I was reminded by Brother Rokos's comment about there's not a section in the back about false teachers. Many years ago, back, I guess it's around the year 80 or 81, somewhere around there, Chuck Lucas came to Kansas City. And we had a great meeting where we were able to sit down and ask questions to him and let him try to answer those questions. And one brother from the Kansas side of the state of the area stood up and said, "I've never heard a false teacher say, 'Oh, I'm a false teacher.'" And that phrase stuck with me, and that really pertains to this lesson that we're looking at today. There can arise another generation that knows God if we warn them about false teachers in sheep's clothing. The primary text we're going to start with is Matthew chapter 7, starting with verse 15. And we'll go ahead and read that to get us kicked off here this morning. And the alternate text that we're looking at also is from 1 Timothy chapter 4, and we'll look at that. We'll interject things from that text as we go through the lesson. Matthew chapter 7, starting with verse 15. Jesus said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves. By their fruit ye shall know them. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but the corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Therefore by their fruits ye shall know them." It's important for all of God's people to beware. It's interesting when you look at the word the gospel and how the gospel is used in the New Testament. There are a lot of times whenever the Bible talks about being warned in connection with the gospel, being warned. The gospel warns people. And the gospel message of Christ warns us to watch for people who aren't teaching the right things. And why is it so important for the brethren to be aware of these false teachers who come in sheep's clothing? Well, if you look at verse 13 and 14, just prior to this statement, Jesus said, "Enter in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And many there be that go in thereby. For narrow is the gate and straitened the way that leadeth to life, and few are they that find it." And so the wolves are going to lead others into the wrong gate. A person needs to enter Christ, and there is only one way to get into Christ. Believing in His deity, repenting to follow His teachings, and being baptized to cleanse our souls in His blood. But many teachers go out into the world who would confuse this and lead people down the wrong path so that they go through the wrong gate, thinking that they're going to heaven. But a false teacher will lead one through the wrong gate. But a false teacher will also lead one down the wrong path. A true Christian will have repented and will continue the effort to avoid sin or error in any form. But there are many teachers who will lead honest and sincere people into believing that certain behaviors are acceptable to God, which God forbade. And so we have to understand that a wolf will direct you to the wrong gate, and a wolf will direct you down the wrong path, even if you've entered the right gate. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, some shall fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons. Now, it's interesting that he calls it doctrines of demons. These are false teachers. These are those wolves that come in teaching something wrong. Why would anyone follow a doctrine of demons? Why would someone give heed to the seducing spirits? Why would someone fall from the faith? Well, and we'll look at the doctrines that he talks about in just a moment. But many times it's because of these wolves that we're talking about. And there may be other causes besides that, because sometimes it originates with the person who goes down that path. But someone is being taught, and Jesus warned people. Peter warned. The Apostle Paul warned. Throughout the letters written to Christians are warnings about the people who are going to be coming and bringing false teachings. But we need to note that the wolves do not enter the fold looking like sheep. And we need to teach our young people to recognize that. They're always going to come disguised. They want to look innocent. They want to look like they belong. And many times that's why congregations get damaged and destroyed, because there's someone there who they weren't recognized for who they really were. They look like sheep. And they may not be recognized at first glance, but their fruit will expose who they truly are. And Jesus described that, didn't he? But Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 24 wrote, some men's sins are open beforehand, going before to judgment, and some men they follow after. And so there are some whose reputation precedes them, we say it that way. We know in advance we better watch out for this person when they come to town. But that's not always the case. Sometimes someone comes into a congregation and they're bringing things and you don't recognize it. You don't realize that's what their intentions are. Many congregations have gone through struggles with individuals like that. I remember Dad telling me many years ago, whenever I was a child and they were attending, we were as a family started going to worship, and my mother was baptized and just before we came here, attending one of the other congregations in the area who hasn't gotten any closer to God than they were then, that Dad had a meeting with the elders and was warning them about one of the men who was teaching things differently in public than he was in private. And they said, oh, that's we'll have to take care of that. And the next Sunday he's up there preaching by their invitation, inviting the wolf to come and present the gospel in Raytown, Missouri. And they've got more people out there that aren't ashamed anymore to be false teachers. And there's a lot of that around as well. But we can't allow the wolves, it wants to recognize, to keep teaching. And young people need to understand it's okay to call a wolf, even if he tries to disguise himself. But sometimes you're not going to see it ahead of time. Sometimes you'll see it afterwards, after the damage is done, after the carnage is there. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 4, the Apostle Paul mentioned that because of false brethren that were unawares brought in to come in privily, to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. And of course, the Galatian brethren were dealing with those coming in trying to enforce their Judaizing beliefs upon the brethren. And they were using a lot of influential ways to do it. Peer pressure. The word privily is not the word that we generally would use in our everyday conversation. I bet these young children here probably don't use privily every day, but they know what a secret is, and they know someone who comes in secretly, and some of the translations will show that. But that's what the word means. They're coming in secretly, which means that they know that they're hiding what they really believe and want to teach. It happened in Eudora. Someone said, well, I won't teach this from the pulpit, but you're willing to teach it privately. And so when the stand was taken, half the congregation left. Well, you can't preach here if that's what you're going to be teaching people. And that's the right decision to make. And so congregations get harmed because of these wolves. Whenever they finally are exposed, they do all the damage they can in a hurry. Well, in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1, Peter warned this. But there were false prophets among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily, there's that word secretly again, they privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And by the way, when he says denying the Lord that bought them, he's not saying we deny Jesus. He's saying that they're denying Him, His rightful place as Lord and Master of their lives by their actions and by their teachings. They refuse to be in submission to Him, and that denies Him the role that He properly has in their lives. That's the way they deny Him. Some of the false teachers in the world today, even among our brethren, will say, well, that means you're denying Jesus. No. It means you're not giving Him the proper place in your life where it's supposed to be. And so there's a lot of doctrines that will be denying Christ, even if they don't deny Christ in word. If they're not teaching what Christ said, then that's a denial of Christ, because you're not following Him anymore. And that's what was going on in the churches of Galatia. Jesus said that you have been taken away from the one that called you and gone to another gospel. But there's not really another gospel. But they perverted the gospel of Christ, you see. And so, whenever people introduce the heresies, the divisions, the false teachings that harm the church, well, they don't usually come out there and announce ahead of time that's what they're going to do. They are wolves dressed like sheep. But in what ways do the wolves disguise themselves? I mean, we're not talking about sheep and wolves after all. We're talking about people. Well, they may look very religious. They may seem to be very evangelistic. And so on the surface, you look at this person and say, oh, how dedicated they are. Look at all the evangelism that they're involved with, and they're out there doing this and that every day. They may look very benevolent. What I find generally, though, when it comes to wolves, is their benevolence usually is self-serving. They're going to be benevolent to the people who they think they can gain something from, but they're not very generous toward anybody else. But a person can seem very benevolent. In Matthew chapter 7, then, verses 18 and 19, what did Jesus say? A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Now, why is he saying that? Because sometimes it looks like on the surface to someone at a distance, oh, this is a great work this person is doing. Look at all this wonderful deeds. Look at all of this evangelism. Look at all of this benevolence. Look at all this. You know what Jesus says about that? Their work is worthless and meaningless to God because they're corrupt trees, and even what looks like good work to you and me, to God looks corrupt. A sinner cannot serve God. And if a person is faithful in his doctrine and teaching, but he's a liar in the street, then he's a false man. He is not a faithful Christian, and he cannot do God's work because God will not accept it. And so a person has to be faithful to God in life and in word. The false teachers come dressed, and they look so innocent. They look so helpful and so much with good intention. They want to help. But what they really want is to help themselves, because they want to glorify themselves in front of men. Study the book of Galatians sometimes with that thought in mind, and you'll see how many times the brethren there were warned about those who were trying to court them, but not for their good. They just wanted someone to brag about. Oh, look at these people. They're following me. They're on my side. And so they weren't trying to help people go to heaven. They were trying to get followers to themselves. Well, people have to be warned of these things. But in reality, it's impossible for one to bear good fruit, even though it appears on the surface that they're doing good. But they're not doing good if they're wolves in sheep's clothing. In reality, a person may seem diligent and good, but he's discovered to be an unrepentant sinner. His fruit cannot be good. In James chapter 2 and verse 9, if you have respect to persons, you commit sin and are convinced of the law as transgressors. Think about that. Whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. James 2 verse 10. And so we need to recognize that, a person worships and teaches and lives a righteous life, but shows partiality. That seems like such a minor thing. Kind of like picking up sticks on the Sabbath day, or picking fruit off the wrong tree. They seem like little things. See, we try to measure things in our lives, in our minds. We try to look at, oh, that's not all that bad. He lied about that, but look at all the good works he's doing. He's partial. He shows partiality to this person because of their race, or because of their language that they speak, or because of how well-to-do that they are. Shows partiality. Well, that's not godly. And that person cannot be serving God. Looks like they're doing a lot of good work, but it's just not going to come out very good in the end. If a person lives a decent life but ignores God's will to assemble with the saints, his fruit cannot be good. And I wish more families understood that. Parents need to realize that by prioritizing this secular events in such a manner that their boundaries are, we're not going to let anything interrupt our child's sport event. Not even God, not even the worship of the church. Well, then that person cannot bring forth good fruit. That's a wolf, leading people astray. Parents need to understand to put the priorities for their children. Don't let the parents be the wolves. How much damage will that be? Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Back there in the text around what Jesus is teaching. He follows all of that with saying, everyone therefore that heareth these words of mine and doeth them shall be likened unto a wise man who built his house upon the rock, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon the rock. And everyone that heareth these words of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man who built his house upon the sand, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and smote upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. You know something? The wolves actually built houses. They built a house just like the wise man did. The foolish one built a house, and on the outside it may look very similar to the one that was built by the wise man. But it's different. The difference is found within the foundation. And so the house will fall one day. A denominational church may look very similar on the surface to the Lord's church. But the willingness to make changes to any doctrine or practice proves that the foundation is not Christ. They're denying Christ. Because He's not the Lord. They are their own lords. They pick and choose which ones of Christ's laws that they want to follow. And they're going to go off where they think it's not important. I'm not the one who has the right to judge whether anything Christ taught is important or not. He's the one who decided that a long time ago. A man may never use profanity or cheat, or maybe he'll do all the things he can to teach his children to be honest and to be good citizens, but if he does not teach them to serve and worship God, to study and to hear God, his house is not built upon Christ. It takes more than just the outward deeds. There has to be the foundation of listening to all the teachings of Christ and following them, and we can't ignore them. And what I think is probably makes all this most dangerous is the fact that these wolves come looking like sheep. They come looking like the very best sheep, the most appealing ones. Just think about what Peter said there in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1 to 3. There arose false prophets among the people, as also there shall be false teachers who shall privily bring in destructive heresies, denying even the master that bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. We've already read that one, but look how he goes on. Many shall follow their lascivious doings. Lascivious. Sometimes you might hear the word licentious. I like that because it has the word license in it. And lasciviousness is the idea of having a license to do something that you shouldn't be able to do. You feel like you've got a license to sin and behave in certain ways that God has forbidden, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And in covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose sentence now from of old lingereth not, and their destruction slumbereth not. It's covetousness. It's lasciviousness. This appeals to the desires of people. And so we can satisfy the desires of our hearts and our flesh. Well, a lot of people like to hear that kind of message. So people are drawn to that. But that's not something that God will overlook. Look in 2 Peter 2, verses 18 and 19. For uttering great swelling words of vanity, they entice in the lusts of the flesh, by lasciviousness, those who are just escaping from them that live in error, promising them liberty, while they themselves are bondservants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he also brought into bondage. Sounds so nice. Oh, I'm free. I'm free. Christ made me free. Well, what he was talking about being free was being free from sin. But we have to be a servant to righteousness to be free from sin. But what do we need to watch for? You know, if you were to see a herd of sheep, and there was a wolf there dressed, just imagine it. You know, you've seen cartoons of it like that probably before. You don't recognize the sheep on the outside, but you know something? If you look at the footprints, a wolf footprint is going to look like a wolf footprint, no matter what he looks like on the outside. And a sheep print is going to look like a sheep print. And so you look at the soil, you look where they've been, and you don't have any problem finding out what they're really up to. Well, you might find a variety of things. You might find a trail of boasting and pride. Well, Jesus deals with that here in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7. Look at chapter 7, verses 22 and 23. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy by thy name? And by thy name cast out demons? And by thy name do many mighty works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. You see, what you find is people who believe that they deserve salvation because of all the wonderful works that they've done. That's a wolf. They think that they're earning it. And they're going to be proud about they want to make sure that you know the deeds that they do. Even ones that no one would know about if they hadn't told you. And they can be very discreet about telling you. It might come out something like this. Well, there might be somebody here in the congregation who, takes so-and-so out to dinner, and spends this much on that person. You just don't know who they are. Well, watch those words. Sometimes they're just talking about themselves, and they just want to make sure you know what they've done. If they're too detailed and too specific about it, how would they know that? Watch for that. That can be a sign of a wolf. But they'll also lead others to follow their examples and a sense of false hope. So there's a trail of this. There's a trail of damaging actions. And sometimes the guilt will be projected upon others in their presence. There might be a trail of character assassinations. You know, Paul had to deal with that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, starting with verse 10, he says, "For his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. Let such a one reckon this, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, such are we also indeed when we are present. For we are not bold to number or compare ourselves with certain of them that commend themselves by they themselves, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves with themselves, are without understanding. But we will not glory beyond our measure, but according to the measure of the province which God apportioned to us as a measure, to reach even unto you. We stretch not ourselves overmuch," he says, "as though we reach not unto you. For we came even as far as unto you in the gospel of Christ, not glorying beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope. As your faith groweth, we shall be magnified in you, according to our providence unto further abundance, so as to preach the gospel even unto the parts beyond you, and not to glory in another's province in regard to things ready in our hand. But he that glorieth, let him glory to the Lord, or in the Lord. Not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth." The Apostle Paul knew how to deal with these folks, didn't he? They commend themselves. They're measuring their goodness based upon how much better they are than the next person. Christ never taught that. The apostles never taught that. We have one standard to try to attain to, and that's Christ. And there's not a living soul who will ever be better than Christ. And so we might as well just humble ourselves and let the wind out of our sails and realize that we're humble individuals, not proud individuals. We have a lot of work to do. We don't need to be braggers. But there can be those who try to diminish. You know, people who exalt themselves and approve themselves, sometimes they'll do it as if they're in competition, and they seek to destroy the ones who they perceive as their greatest threat to that victory or that honor. So they live for comparing themselves to others rather than comparing themselves to Christ. And if you think about it, the gall, they accused Paul of exalting himself. And of all the apostles that you read, you know, you don't read any of the apostles exalting themselves, not even the Apostle Paul. He was a humble man. Look how he describes himself in some of the things. Well, he's, you know, in his presence, he's kind of not all that amazing, is he? People wonder about the thorn in the flesh, and I don't know what it was. Neither does anybody else living today. Paul knew. God knew. But he had some struggles in his life. There were times whenever he had a hard time seeing. He would write one of his letters and even say, I wrote this with my own hand. How large a letters that I've written with my own hand. But many times other people would write for him. But we know that he had struggles physically in his life. Now look at the trail that's left behind. Sometimes you're going to find the trail of broken congregations. There's just trouble over and over everywhere they go. You ever heard someone talk about how they go to this congregation and they had this problem? And they went to the next congregation and they had the same problem. And these are good congregations. They go to another congregation and they had the same problem over there. Well, maybe The problem is not those congregations. Maybe it's the person who's bouncing from congregation to congregation causing trouble in those places. So if you see someone who bounces from congregation to congregation to congregation and leaves a trail of destruction, there at least ought to be a yellow flag. This could be a wolf. He talks a good talk, but he walks the walk of a wolf. And so there can be those things. You know, the 80-70 doctrine has raised its ugly head again over the last few years. It's amazing. Something that is so plainly taught in the Scriptures as our hope of Christ coming and taking us home is brought into question by lying false teachers who present themselves as if they're the only ones who know anything. But we have to watch. You know, when they first started teaching those things, when Steve Baisden and those guys started teaching that stuff out there, and I think they were from up in Michigan originally or somewhere around there, they weren't telling everybody, oh, we're going to start stirring up trouble in the church. They've become troublemakers. False teachers, the same as Max King did. And so we see the trend, though, in a broad scope, away from applying the Bible to any circumstance, getting people not to pay attention to the Bible so they will accept anything and everything. And what this does is, for those who refuse to go that direction, you have trouble within the congregation. You might find a trail of backbiting and defaming. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 20, he talks about this. Pardon me, I've lost my place, so that's not a very good thing to do. For I fear lest when I come I shall not find you such as I would. Then I should be found unto you such as you would not, lest there be debates, envyings, wraths, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, and tumults. And so what you find there is Paul is concerned that the possibility would be there because of these others who are exalting themselves and trying to get followers to themselves. There might end up being this sort of strifes and things within the congregation. And so that kind of stuff is a sure sign that there's a wolf in the pack. Or maybe in the herd. The wolves hope it's a pack. You might find the trail whose influence formed bad opinions of the church or lost interest of the church. If you think about what James wrote, James chapter 3, verses 4 to 6, behold, the ships also, they are so great and driven by rough winds, yet are turned about by a very small rudder, whether the impulse of the steersman willeth. So the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how much wood is kindled, by how small a fire, and the tongue is a fire. The world of iniquity among our members is the tongue, which defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the wheel of nature, and is set on fire by hell. But then he goes on in verse 8, but the tongue can no man tame. It is a restless evil, it is full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we the Lord the Father, and therewith curse we men, and we are made after the likeness of God. Out of the same mouth cometh blessing and cursing. Now, do you think the blessing maybe looks like a sheep, but the cursing shows that he's a wolf? My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Doth the fountain send forth from the same opening sweet water and bitter? And he's not suggesting that it should all be bitter. We should have sweet water coming out of our fountains. And so he wants us to be people who are blessers and not cursers. That it's just like Jesus said, an evil tree cannot bring forth good fruit. It may seem on the surface to be good, but that tree is evil because it makes corrupt fruit. The fountain is corrupt in this case because of the cursing. So the blessing of God is vain. You might find the trail of damaging teachings. Converts who never really followed Christ, or converts who consistently go astray. You ever known that? People who baptize a lot of people, but they never seem to be there. Well, that could be a wolf. He's out there putting on a show, but they're not there. What have they been taught? You know, it's easy to convert people to baptism. It's a lot easier to convert people to baptism than to convert them to Christ, because converting someone to Christ requires a change of life. Converting someone to baptism is just a one instant thing in life. So, yeah, we can get past that, then we're okay. That's not, but if you see a trail of that, that might be an indication, something to look for. What about a consistent pattern of people that they've baptized but were never really converted? You know, they come, but they don't live the life. And it's not just one here and there. It's consistent with the people that they're teaching, which shows that they're not teaching something. I remember going to a lesson one time. I heard a guy came over to Latvia one time, and I met some people who later became good, faithful, godly people in the church there. But this man comes over there and he's talking about conversion. And he talks about faith. He talks about confessing Christ, and talks about being baptized. And someone I was there attending that with said, "Whatever happened to repentance?" And it wasn't even mentioned once in any of the papers that he was handing out to use to try to teach people how to be a Christian. What happened to repentance? If the wolf is teaching someone to be baptized, but they don't teach about repentance, well, that's a wolf. That's not a sheep. Okay? That's what they're going to do, because they're looking for themselves and not for the glory of God. You might see a consistent pattern of people who believe or practice the same error. So if someone is coming from a congregation and someone has taught them, and they're off on divorce and remarriage again. Maybe they think that you just can't commit adultery, no matter who you marry. Well, of course you're going to meet. I've taught people who probably believe that today too, but they didn't get it from me. You probably all taught people and converted them that have gone that direction. But if most of the people you teach go that direction, that might be an indication that that's a wolf. If someone has doubts about instrumental music and worship, and consistently all the people that you teach and baptize have a consistent doubt about that, then maybe that's a wolf teaching them. These are signs. These are things we can look for. Look for a trail that follows this person. Does everyone have the same bad attitude? Does everyone have the same negative beliefs about the church or the wrong doctrine that you've been teaching? Well, then that could be a reflection upon you. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, he says, "I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel." The error that they were slipping to was spread throughout the whole region. It wasn't one congregation. This was a whole area. Well, that tells you something. It tells you somebody is going not only to one congregation, but to a lot of places. So that can help you track down the wolf. Who's been to all these places? Because whoever's been to all these places is the one who's spreading this false doctrine. You got to be circumcised if you want to go to heaven. Well, if you see that, then look for the wolf. Back in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, he says, we see that the doctrines, by the way, have nothing to do with the plan of salvation as far as believing and confessing and repenting. And, well, it does deal with repenting, but being baptized doesn't have to do with belief in Jesus per se. The Spirit saith expressly that in the latter time some shall fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons through the hypocrisy of men that speak lies, branded in their own conscience as with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, commanding to abstain from meats. What does that have to do with belief in Jesus? Doctrine is important, and if someone teaches the wrong doctrine, that's the wolf. It doesn't have to be about baptism or about instrumental music even. It can be about regular everyday things in life. And if someone introduces these doctrines, he says these are people who have lost their salvation. God created the meats to be received with thanksgiving by them that believe and know the truth. If a brother comes into a congregation and tells everybody, you can't eat pork, he doesn't have the right to teach that. If he doesn't want to eat it, that's okay. But he needs to learn. He can't enforce that on somebody else. If a brother wants to come into a building and say, you can't eat in the church building, He doesn't have the right to force that on anybody. That's false doctrine. And it does make a soul lost if they go that direction. You know, you don't have to eat in the church building. But it's a false teaching to say that you can't do it. And that will, here's a person who is a hypocrite, speaking lies. And so there are a lot of things that people can do that pervert the message. But these are wolves. But how can we overcome the wolves? Well, the same way we overcome the lion. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, be sober, be watchful, and literally, if you want to look at the literal meaning of what he says in that verse, be sober, be vigilant or watchful, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, whom he may devour. Really, he's teaching people to be sober, or to abstain from wine, which is the word sober there. Abstain from wine. Yes, the Bible does teach it. To be sober and to stay awake. Don't ignore the footprints of the wolf. Stay awake. Stay alert. If there's a sheep missing, try to find out where he went. There might be a wolf in the pack. A wolf out there. Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 to 26, which we've read all around that. But he says, everyone therefore that heareth these words of mine and doeth them shall be likened to the wise man. So we need to hear the teachings of Christ and do them if we want to be able to identify the wolves and stay clear of their damage. But finally, in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6, Paul wrote, if thou put the brethren in mind of these things, thou shalt be a good minister of Christ Jesus, nourished in the words of the faith and of the good doctrine which thou hast followed until now. And so there needs to be this reminding people of these things. And by teaching, that's the way we prepare people to watch out for the wolves. But he goes on a few verses later and says, these things command and teach. Sound teaching will help prepare people for the wolves. You may not recognize every false doctrine beforehand, but you know what the truth looks like. And whenever you see something different, you'll know it's not the same. But then he goes on, and I would add this for the young people as well. Because even though you identify the wolf, you need to remember this. Let no man despise thy youth, but be an example to them that believe in word and manner of life and love and faith and purity. Learn to identify the wolves. Teach people about them, but don't let people despise your youth. There has to be some wisdom in dealing with it so that you won't turn people away, but you'll draw them toward the gospel of Christ. Thank you very much.